Governance and movements. Every revolution thus consists of two different aspects: factual revolution plus spiritual reform, namely actual struggle for state power plus the virtual struggle for the transformation of customs, of the substance of everyday life, what Hegel called the silent weaving of the spirit, which undermines the invisible foundations of power, so that the formal change is the final act of taking note of what has already taken place. For one has only to remind the dead form that it is dead, and it disintegrates. In his Phenomenology, again, Hegel quotes the famous passage from Diderot's Nephew of Rameau about the silent, ceaseless weaving of the spirit in the simple inwardness of its substance. It infiltrates the noble parts through and through, and soon has taken complete possession of all the vitals and members of the unconscious idol. Then, one fine morning, it gives its comrade a shove with the elbow. A bang, crash, the idol lies on the floor. On one fine morning, whose noon is bloodless if the infection has penetrated to every organ of spiritual life. This, however, is not Hegel's final word. He goes on to point out that this spirit concealing its action from itself is only one side of the realization of pure insight. At the same time, being a conscious act, this spirit must give its moments a definite manifest existence, and must appear on the scene as a sheer uproar and a violent struggle with its antithesis. In the transition to the new, there is a passionate struggle going on, which is over once the opposing force notices how its very opposition is already impregnated with the opponent's logic. This, then, is how we are to read the two apparently opposed features: the priority of the form, the silent weaving of the spirit, together. The latter does not concern content, but the form itself. Again, in the case of a televangelist preacher, this silent weaving undermines his message at the level of its own form. The way he delivers the message subverts its content. The lesson of failures such as the Cultural Revolution is that the focus should be shifted from the utopian goal of the full reign of productive expressivity that no longer needs representation, state order, capital, and so forth, to the question, what kind of representation should replace the existing liberal democratic representative state? Is Negri's proposal of a citizen's income not an indication in this sense? It is an institutional representative measure, not for homini sacer, for full citizens. It implies state representation. It is not linked to an individual's productivity, but is the representative condition and framework for opening up the possible space of expressive productivity. Negri characterizes the contemporary situation as one of permanent governance. Power is broken into two. In order to be realized, it no longer has the possibility of determining a norm, then executing it subsequently in a concrete administrative act. The norm can't be realized without consensus, which has to be seen as the participation of subjects. Incidentally, this notion of dual power, of governance as the interaction between representative state power and councils of expressive movements, has a long tradition on the left. Among others, it was advocated by Kautsky in 1918-19, when he rejected the exclusive alternative, either the National Assembly or the Council Assembly, seeking their integration, with each of them fulfilling different and specific tasks. The councils, Kautsky argued, ought not to be chosen as the sole form of electoral representation, even if they enjoyed the support of the majority of the population, for they were deficient both technically and politically. To opt exclusively for the council form would be to introduce a system based on workplace and occupation that would exact particularist and corporatist tendencies. In parliamentary elections to a National Assembly, on the other hand, social interests were homogenized and great political parties came to the fore. Trotsky, the target of Kautsky's critique, advocates the same duality when he makes a plea for the interplay between class self-organization and political leadership of the revolutionary vanguard party. The main form of direct democracy of the expressive multitude in the 20th century was so-called councils, Soviets, Almost everybody in the West loved them, including liberals such as Hannah Arendt, who perceived in them the echo of the ancient Greek life of the polis. Throughout the epoch of really existing socialism, the secret hope of democratic socialists was the direct democracy of the Soviets, the local councils as the form of self-organization of the people. And it is deeply symptomatic how, with the decline of really existing socialism, this emancipatory shadow which haunted it all the time has also disappeared. Is this not the ultimate confirmation of the fact that the conciliar model of democratic socialism was just a spectral double of bureaucratic, really existing socialism, its inherent transgression with no substantial positive content of its own, that is, unable to serve as the permanent basic organizing principle of a society? What both really existing socialism and conciliar democracy shared was the belief in the possibility of a self-transparent organization of society, which would preclude political alienation. State apparatuses, institutionalized rules of political life, legal order, the police, and so on. And is the basic experience of the end of really existing socialism not precisely the rejection of this shared feature, the resigned postmodern acceptance of the fact that society is a complex network of subsystems, which is why a certain level of alienation is constitutive of social life, so that a totally self-transparent society is a utopia with totalitarian potential? No wonder then that the same holds for today's practices of direct democracy, from the favelas to post-industrial digital culture. Do the descriptions of the new tribal communities of computer hackers not often evoke the logic of conciliar democracy? They all have to rely on a state apparatus, that is, for structural reasons. They cannot take over the entire field. Negri's motto, "No governing without movements," should therefore be countered with "no movements without governing," without a state power sustaining the space for movements. Negri dismisses the representative democratic system. The parliamentary system of representation has gone bad. You can't do anything there. We need to invent new things. However, insofar as expressive movements have to rely on a presupposed ground, one can defend democracy, not the direct form, but precisely the representative form, as providing the necessary ground for the movement's exercise of expressive freedom, its abstract universal formal character, one person, one vote, and so on, is the only appropriate one for providing such a neutral ground. It is the tension between representative democracy and the movement's direct expression that allows us to formulate the difference between an ordinary democratic political party and the stronger, uppercase, party, as in Communist Party. An ordinary political party fully assumes the representative function. Its entire legitimization is provided by elections, while the party considers the formal procedure of democratic elections secondary, as regards the real political dynamics of movements expressing their force. This, of course, does not mean that the party looks for its legitimization in movements which are external to it. The party rather posits itself as the movement's Selbstaufhebung, self-sublation. It does not negotiate with movements. It is not a movement transubstantiated into the form of political universality, ready to assume full state power, and which, as such, ne s'autorise que de lui-même. Where democracy is not enough is with regard to what Badiou called the constitutive excess of representation over the represented. At the level of the law, state power only represents the interests, and so on, of its subjects. It serves them. It is responsible to them and is itself subjected to their control. However, at the level of the superego underside, the public message of responsibility and the rest is supplemented by the obscene message of unconditional exercise of power. Laws do not really bind me. I can do to you whatever I want. I can treat you as guilty if I decide so. I can destroy you if I say so. This obscene excess is a necessary constituent of the notion of sovereignty, whose signifier is the master signifier. The asymmetry is here structural. That is, the law can only sustain its authority if subjects hear in it the echo of the obscene, unconditional self-assertion. Democracy presupposes a minimum of alienation. Those who exert power can only be held responsible to the people if there is a minimal distance of representation between them and the people. In totalitarianism, this distance is cancelled. The leader is supposed to directly present the will of the people, and the result is, of course, that the empirical people are even more radically alienated in their leader. He directly is what they really are, their true identity, their true wishes and interests, as opposed to their confused empirical wishes and interests. In contrast to the authoritarian power alienated from its subjects, the people, here the empirical people, are alienated from themselves. This, of course, in no way implies a simple plea for democracy and rejection of totalitarianism. There is, on the contrary, a moment of truth in totalitarianism. Hegel had already pointed out how political representation does not mean that people already know in advance what they want and then charge their representatives with advocating their interests. They only know them in themselves. It is their representative who formulates their interests and goals for them, making them for themselves. The totalitarian logic thus makes explicit, posits as such, a split which always already cuts from within the represented people. One should not be afraid here to draw the radical conclusion concerning the figure of the leader. Democracy, as a rule, cannot reach beyond pragmatic utilitarian inertia. It cannot suspend the logic of the servicing of goods, service des biens. Consequently, in the same way that there is no self-analysis, since the analytic change can only occur through the transferential relationship onto the external figure of the analyst, a leader is necessary to trigger the enthusiasm for a cause, to bring about the radical change in the subjective position of his followers, to transubstantiate their identity. What this means is that the ultimate question of power is not, is it democratically legitimized or not, but what is the specific character, the social content, of the totalitarian excess that pertains to sovereign power as such, independently of its democratic or non-democratic character. It is at this level that the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat functions. In it, the totalitarian excess of power is on the side of the part of no part, not on the side of the hierarchical social order. To put it bluntly, ultimately, the people are in power in the full sovereign sense of the term. In other words, it is not only that their representatives temporarily occupy the empty place of power, but much more radically, they twist the very space of state representation in their direction. One could argue that Chavez and Morales are coming close to what could be the contemporary form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Although interacting with many agents and movements, drawing on their support, their governments obviously have privileged links with the dispossessed of the favelas. Chavez is ultimately their president. They are the hegemonic force behind his rule, and although Chavez still respects the democratic electoral process, it is clear that his fundamental commitment and source of legitimization is not there, but in the privileged relationship with the poor. This is the dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of democracy. A convincing story can be told about the hypocrisy of the Western left, which to a large extent ignores the striking liberal renaissance that is going on in Iran's civil society. Since the Western intellectual references of this renaissance are figures such as Habermas, Arendt, and Rorty, even Giddens, not the usual gang of anti-imperialist radicals, the left makes no fuss when leading figures of this movement lose their jobs and are arrested, and so on. With their advocacy of the boring topics of the division of powers, of democratic legitimization, of the legal defense of human rights, and so forth, they are viewed with suspicion. They do not appear as sufficiently anti-imperialist and anti-American. However, one should nonetheless raise the more fundamental question: is bringing Western liberal democracy the real solution for getting rid of the religious fundamentalist regimes? Or are these regimes rather a symptom of liberal democracy itself? What to do in cases like those of Algeria or the Palestinian territories, where a free democratic election brings fundamentalists to power? When Rosa Luxemburg wrote that dictatorship consists in the way in which democracy is used and not in its abolition, her point was not that democracy is an empty framework which can be used by different political agents. Hitler also came to power through, more or less, free democratic elections, but that there is a class bias inscribed into this very empty procedural frame. This is why, when radical leftists come to power through elections, their signe de reconnaissance is that they move to change the rules, to transform not only the electoral and other state mechanisms, but also the entire logic of the political space, relying directly on the power of mobilized movements, imposing different forms of local self-organization, and so on. In short, to guarantee the hegemony of their base, they are, in order, guided by a correct intuition regarding the class bias of the democratic form.